So those of you who know me know that I am obsessed with American politics. This time 4 years ago, I was living in Naples, Florida. I was volunteering for the Hillary campaign and was just living best life. I was near a beach. I'd get up in the morning, I'd swim, and there'd be dolphins in the sea. And then I'd get coffee from Dunkin' Donuts, and then I'd go and spend my afternoons persuading people to vote for Hillary Clinton, unsuccessfully, obviously, and I'm sorry about that. But super interested in what is happening over there now, what might happen on November 3rd, I think George said it is, Tuesday after next. But obviously, in all of the potential scenarios that 2020 could fling at us, it is very possible that the Electoral College comes into, it's possible, there is always a possibility, it's 2020, anything is possible, that the Electoral College comes into play in a way that it hasn't before. But don't worry, because you will learn everything you need to know to understand it in all its possible permutations from this presentation from George. This is his second time speaking at Nerd Night. The previous one had some surprise impressions which startled us all. I don't know if that's happening as well tonight, but please, George, remember we're all sitting at home. But, you know, we're vulnerable. These are tough times, so be kind. But can I hand over to you, please?
Okay.
So obviously, if this were real time, we'd be welcoming you to the stage with a round of applause. But as it is, you just have to imagine that. Thank you, Charles. You okay to bring your slides up?
Yeah. There we go.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so good evening, everybody. And well, this will be the next 15 minutes or 20 minutes of your life. So I'm going to be talking about the US Electoral College. I'm going to be looking at, first of all, how it works today. If it's possible to explain that, I will give it a go, and then move on to some of the history. So to look at how this came into being, and then look at some of the arguments for and against the Electoral College, look at the various attempts that there have been to reform it or to abolish it, and finally to look at the effect of all this on November the 3rd and this year's election. So as you might have guessed from the map and the familiar faces, including me, apparently I'm on the list of people who were president, the Electoral College, if this will work, it does. The Electoral College elects the president and of course the vice president, and the president obviously lives and works in the White House. But just how does this work? So as you can see, we have a map with lots of numbers all over it. So the Electoral College is made up of a certain number of people, and each state has a certain number of Electoral College votes. So this is based on each state's representation in Congress. So that's the number of House seats it has and the number of Senate seats, which is 2. So for example, Wyoming has 1 House seat and 2 Senate seats, so it has 3 Electoral College votes. And at the other end, we have California, which has 53 House seats and 2 Senate seats, which gives it 55. Now, the mathematicians here who have managed to quickly scan all these numbers, add them all up, will notice that there is a grand total of 538 Electoral College votes. These are actual people, and I'll explain what they can and can't do later on. So there are 538 people. The advanced mathematicians may be able to work out that if we divide this number by 2 and we add 1, we get 270. That's why everyone is obsessed when it comes to American elections with 270, because any candidate needs at least 270 Electoral College votes to become the president. But how does each state determine how to allocate the Electoral College votes? Here we go. Now, I should explain before we go any further, the pencil, it just happens to be positioned in a certain place that may or may is not meant to imply what people should or shouldn't do. So imagine that the pencil either isn't there or that it's sort of between the two. So each state holds an election in their state to decide which of the presidential candidates gets their state's electoral votes. Now, so essentially it's not one national election, it's basically 51, the 50 states plus Washington, DC. But because it's America, it isn't simple, as you can tell from what I've said so far, but there are 3 different voting systems in total. Here we go. So in 48 states plus Washington, DC, relatively simple, the candidate with the most votes wins all of the electoral college votes in that state. So if we go back to Wyoming, I think it's safe to say Donald Trump will probably just about manage to win Wyoming. Donald Trump will win all 3 of the electoral college votes. So it's a bit like first past the post for people obsessed with UK elections. Then we have Nebraska, which is similar, but they award 2 electoral votes to the statewide winner, and then they give 1 electoral vote each to the winner in each congressional district. So they have 3 congressional districts. So that's perfectly simple. And if you want it to get even more complicated, let's go to Maine. In Maine, they, until this election, they did the same thing as Nebraska. They'd have 2 electoral college votes for the statewide winner and 1 for each of the 2 congressional districts. But this year, they have decided to use, well, it's called very different names, preferential voting or ranked choice voting, or the alternative vote, for those who remember the 2011 referendum. That's nobody then. So basically in Maine, voters can number the candidates, but you'll be delighted to know that I will not be going into the detail of how the alternative vote works, because it just isn't time. So to put all of this together, to try and make it slightly more real, let's have an example. Louise, this may bring back some unhappy memories, but here we go. So we have the map here. All the red is for Donald Trump. All the blue was for Clinton. And you can see that I'm not making the stuff up about Maine. Maine split its electoral votes. So Trump got 1 of the votes. So yeah, so we have the red states and the blue states, or as Trump would say, if you have the red states and then you take away the blue states, you take away the blue states and you just have my states for me. It's great. Big win. Okay, enough of him. So that's what this looked like on a map. But now let's see what happened when all the votes were counted. So we have here, you can see, so on, I think it's everybody's left, but anyway, on one side we have the popular vote. So that's when all the votes are added up. Clinton got 48%, Trump 46%, others 6%, but that translated into a win for Trump in the Electoral College. So the important point here is that the popular vote doesn't matter. What matters is the number of Electoral College votes. And this is one of the things that is commonly misunderstood about how US elections work. So there's no link at all. Now, I've been going at this quite quickly, so let's just all breathe and let's just recap what I've just said to try and explain what happens. So in each state, what happens is the candidates who are running, or their party, select a group of electors. And what happens when people vote on election day, the voters think they're voting for Donald Trump directly or Joe Biden directly, but they're actually not. They're voting for a group of electors who will then go on to vote for Joe Biden or Donald Trump. So, I mean, it's really that simple, if anyone is still keeping up. So basically, people vote for the people who then vote for the people they thought they were voting for in the first place. So it really is as simple as that. So one question you might be asking, or maybe it's just me asking it, these 538 individuals, do they have to vote as they were pledged to? So do they have to vote for the person that they were pledge to? And of course, because it's America, the answer is yes, no, and maybe, depending on which state we're in. Now, I oversimplified this earlier. This was the actual result of the Electoral College vote in 2016. So as you can see, 7 people decided to do their own thing and not vote for the candidate that they said they were going to. And there were 3 other people who tried to. They tried to vote for Bernie Sanders, but they were booted off by the state. They said, you can't do that. Because in some states, they have laws which say the electors must vote for who they pledge to. And if you don't, you can get thrown off and told to vote somebody else. But in other states, there's no rule at all. So technically speaking, as those 7 people did, they can do what they want. They can have said, oh yeah, I'm going to vote for Trump, and then they get there and they don't, or they can vote for Clinton. In some states, they decide in their wisdom, oh yes, if you vote against the way you pledge to, oh yeah, well, I mean, we'll give you a fine, but your vote will still count. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there. So one question after explaining all of this that you might be interested to know is, how on earth did this system even come into existence? So let's have a look at the history now. And so how did it all come about? Well, it all came about because of the Constitutional Convention, which was held between 1787 and 1789. And the Electoral College, it was a compromise between different positions. So some people said we want a popularly elected president, and other people said no, we don't want a president at all. It was also seen as a compromise between the smaller states, who were slightly overrepresented in the Electoral College, and the larger states. So it's quite ironic that this system was specifically designed to avoid having the people voting for the president, but we've ended up having 51 elections. And to explain that a little bit more, let's look at how this system has evolved. So the key thing here is that it's up to the states to decide how they allocate their Electoral College votes. That's why Maine and Nebraska can do their own thing. But also in the beginning, not that many states actually held elections. They just said, right, the state legislature will appoint electors. But what's happened over time is that every state has individually on their own decided to hold an election to decide who their electors will be. So that is basically why the system we have today is as it is, because it's evolved, or perhaps more accurately, mutated. So I think what the founders had in mind, although you mustn't pretend that we know what the founders were thinking, I think they had in mind more of a system where the people wouldn't have a direct say in choosing the president, because they were worried about who might become president. But we won't go into who they might have been thinking about. But we have the system as it exists today, despite the caveat that it wasn't meant to do what it does today. So what are some of the arguments for and against? So the arguments for, or that are put for the system, are that smaller states have a greater say, and that's argued to be a good thing because it keeps the United States together. But anyway, and if you want to win the election under this system, you have to have a broader appeal. So you can't just appeal to the states that have large populations. But then we flip it around and we go on the arguments against. There's just a small focus, as we'll see in a bit, on swing states. And there's the obvious slight flaw with this system, which that the person with the most votes can actually lose the election. And that's happened, obviously it happened 4 years ago, and it happened in 2000. So as you can imagine, the system is slightly odd, and therefore there have been various attempts over the years to reform or abolish it. Now, the closest that they came to abolishing the Electoral College altogether was in the 1970s, when there was a proposal to move to a system where you'd have a nationwide vote, and if nobody had more than 50% of the vote, the top 2 candidates would go through to the second round. So it's a bit like how it works in France, but that failed because it was filibustered in the Senate, like so many things end up being. the current campaign to reform it, not to get rid of it, but to reform it, is something called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And the grand plan among the states that have signed up to this is that once they get to 270 electoral votes between them, they will all change their respective laws to say, we will give all of our electoral votes to the popular vote winner. But they're not at 270 yet, and they, well, they're not going to get there by November the 3rd. So until then, they stick with the system that they have. And one point perhaps to consider, is reform desirable? Well, yes, because, well, partly we're what, 15 minutes in, and even maybe I've confused myself in terms of how the system actually works. So we have a system, obviously, where the person with the most votes can lose. So, of course, reform is desirable in that sense. But, of course, we must always be aware of the danger or the potential for unintended consequences. Because if you were to move to a national popular vote, you would have to have the federal government deciding how elections, you'd have to have some way of determining what the national popular vote was. You'd have to have uniform rules on the franchise. Now, all these things, probably a good thing. But again, it's America. So any proposal to change the system would be met with opposition. And now the bit that we've all been waiting for those who are still here. So I went a bit mad with this map. So to explain, in grey, I feel like Jeremy Vine now. In grey, we have all of the states where the margin between Trump and Clinton 4 years ago was 10% or less. So as Jeremy Vine was saying, it would only take a 5% swing one way or another for these states to change. But even with this sort of slightly generous battleground, if we look at the number here, I'm pointing, I'm just pointing. So we only have 230 electoral college votes in grey. So that's a majority of them that are already red or they're already blue. So we have California and New York, two big states with lots of people, but no one is that particularly interested in. And if we do a slightly more realistic battleground, so a non-Jeremy Vine one, it's even smaller, the number of electoral college votes and the number of states that actually matter. And okay, Texas may be in play this year, but I've put it in red because I decided to put it in red. So I hope that I've managed to explain how the system works, but then my excuse, if I have failed to do so, is that if you think you understand the Electoral College, it means that you don't. So that's my excuse. And if anyone has any questions, apart from CNN, we don't want questions from CNN. Oh, that was Trump again. If anyone has any questions, ask away. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Also, that was. I am glad that you kept the invitations to a minimum. I appreciate it. Obviously.
Wrong.
Yes, there are questions in the chat. I think Evie's just going through them now. I mean, some of them were from me, confession. But yes, Evie, are you ready to ask questions to George?
I am indeed.
Excellent.
So, first question is, why does New Jersey have so many, given it's tiny?
Because it has more people there. It may be geographically smaller, but
follow up to that is it has similar population to other states that have fewer. So someone pointed that out, and the answer was that it apparently has more than similarly populated.
So there is a time lag. So basically the electoral college votes that they're allocated or reallocated every 10 years based on the census. So all the numbers that I showed are based on the 2010 census. So after this election, this is why there's a sort of big there's controversy over the census this year. The data from the census this year will be used to calculate how many electoral college votes each state gets for So from 2024 onwards, and my maths is failing me. So the data now is sort of, it's 10 years out of date. So that may be why there's a slight discrepancy. So in some states where they've had a larger population growth in the last 10 years, that isn't reflected, or it won't be reflected until in 4 years' time, if that answers the question. That's my theory anyway.
Next one is slightly related. If we add more Senate seats to the states whose population has increased, or add states and senators like DC and Puerto Rico, would that automatically increase the number of electoral college votes?
Yes, is the short answer to that. So it didn't always used to be 538. It used to be, there were fewer before Hawaii and Alaska became states. So yeah, so if they have more states that join, the number of electoral college votes goes up. Yeah, unless they were to change the rules on how that would work. But yeah.
So next question is, the Electoral College is biased in favor of the Republicans right now. Did the Democrats ever benefit from it in the past?
So the short answer to that is yes. In that it's a bit like first past the post in this country, for example. So if a party's in a position where they're consistently getting the most votes, generally there's sometimes a point where they do really well. So you think of, say, the 97 Labour landslide, for example, they only got 43% of the vote, but they got a lot of seats. So in the past, yes, Democrats have benefited from the system. So actually Obama, in his 2 wins, he got, I think it was 52, 51% at various points, but he got, in percentage terms, more electoral votes than his share of the vote. So yeah, it depends on scenario. There have been Democrat landslides in the past, 1932 and 36 and so on. So yeah, it hasn't always been biased towards the Republicans, but in this current moment, it clearly is. But I mean, that may change over time depending on how things pan out. But yeah, at the moment it's biased to the Republicans, but that may change because it's been different in the past. So yeah.
The next question is, can you explain the tiebreaker when it's 269, and has that ever happened?
So I did what I was tempted to include this in the presentation, but realized it would be here forever. So if there is tie, or if nobody gets to 270, the first thing that happens is everyone looks up what happens if there's a tie. So if that happens, the House of Representatives in January, so the one that's elected in November, not the outgoing one, they decide who the president is, but they don't do it. They do it where each state has 1 vote. So what would happen is the 53 members from California, they would all vote. And if a majority of them voted for somebody, let's say they would vote for Joe Biden, California's 1 vote would go to Joe Biden, whereas Wyoming's 1 member of the House would cast his state's 1 vote, and you'd need 26 votes to win in the House. Makes total sense, doesn't it? Meanwhile, the Senate chooses the vice president. So you could potentially be in a scenario where you have presidents and vice presidents from different parties. So let's say we could end up with, if the Republicans control 26 delegations in the House, you could get President Trump, and if the Democrats have taken control of the Senate, you could get Vice President Harris. So that would be fun.
And can I interrupt there just to, yes. Do they have to choose the presidents who were on the ballot, or could they write in Colin Powell?
So they can pick, so in the House, they pick the top 3 candidates, sorry, the 3 most popular candidates in the Electoral College vote. So if there are 3 candidates that get electoral votes, so yes, technically, if there's a faithless elector who's just voted for 1 person, the top 3 would go through, and in the Senate, it's the top 2 vice president. it has happened in the past, not where there's been a tie, but where a candidate, where nobody's got to 270. But I will confess, off the top of my head, I can't remember when it did happen. It was very messy, and there were lots of votes. It took forever to, not forever, it didn't obviously take forever because they're not still doing it. But it has happened before, but not for a while. But it's 2020, so knowing our luck, it may happen this year. So that was a non-answer to end the answer. But
next question is, I believe there are some states which are considering ignoring the Electoral College and granting their votes according to the nationwide popular vote. Is that right? And if so, is that legal?
Well, we could be finding out quite soon. So the short answer is, okay, technically, as I said earlier, the state legislatures decide how to allocate their electoral college votes. In 2000, I will get to the point eventually. In 2000, when there was the Bush versus Gore, when it went to the Supreme Court, the Florida legislature, they started paving the way for, because there's a deadline by which each state has to certify who its electoral college votes went to. And what the Florida legislature were trying to do is to they were thinking, if we miss the deadline, then we will just, as the Florida legislature, we will just appoint, I think it was 25 people, I can't remember how many it was at the time, we will appoint 25 people to decide what to do. Now, one doomsday scenario for this year is potentially, if one of the candidates, who shall remain nameless, tries to claim that they didn't lose, there is one scenario where if it's quite close, or if it's disputed in one or two states, there is the potential scenario that Republican-controlled state legislatures, that's a mouthful, they could potentially start proceedings to say, we will ignore the popular vote in our state, and we will appoint X number of people to vote for Donald Trump. However, there are lots of steps that we have to go down before we get there. And some of these states that we're talking about, so say, for example, Michigan or Pennsylvania, there are Democrat governors. So if the state legislature decided to start that, then the Democrat governor could say no. There are all sorts of fun scenarios where the state legislature, not fun, but terrifying scenarios where the state legislature says, we vote for Trump, but the governor says, no, we vote for Biden. And Congress at that stage, they're meant to count what the governor says, not that. So it can be very messy. We're not there yet. It could happen, but I think basically it depends on the results on election night, but also it depends basically how far Republicans in these states, who unlike Donald Trump would have to face the voters again in 2 years, how far are they really prepared to go to keep him in power? And we won't know that for a few weeks. So I think that answers the question, or if it doesn't, I apologize. I tried.
There are so many questions pouring in and the WhatsApp, but I think we maybe have time for one or two more. So next one, is Trump concerned, seeing as he's holding rallies in Georgia, Iowa, and Texas?
I'm not concerned at all. I mean, I'm doing great. I'm going to win Idaho, by the way. Did you know that? Yeah, I think he's slightly worried because he continues to display even more unique behavioral characteristics, shall we say. Yeah, I mean, I think it changes all the time. I think he's given up, or his campaign at least, they've given up on Michigan. I mean, when you're trying to campaign in the states that are reliably Republican, so normally Georgia is Republican, but they're trying to focus on there. So when you're basically playing defense, as the Americans might say, yeah, I think he is worried, not just by the never-ending tweets and rantings and ravings, but yeah, I think he is worried, as I've said several times. You never know. It's America. I mean, there are three outcomes: a narrow Trump victory, a narrow Biden victory, or a relatively clear.
Or they both die of COVID before the election, or they both die of COVID between the election and January. There are so many more.
The one advantage of the Electoral College is at least there are 538 people that could step in at that point. And I mean, so without being too morbid, the only example of a candidate no longer being around, there was a candidate, and I can't remember the year. It doesn't matter because they didn't win, but anyway, there was a losing candidate lost. Yes, a losing candidate lost. Yes, although with the Electoral College, maybe they won. I don't know. Yes, a losing candidate, so they lost, and they sadly died after the election. So there was a question mark: what do their electors do? And they basically they voted for all sorts of different people, but it didn't really matter. So we've never had a scenario where a winning candidate has died before. There was a president who basically decided not to wear. They didn't take health precautions when it came to making their inauguration speech, and it went on for so long that they died. They caught. Anyway, this has got very uplifting. Happy, we can be happy. Make Nerd Night great again. Whatever the slogan is, I don't know. You worked for Hillary, Louise? That's terrible.
Evie, have we got time for one more? Is that the last bit? If I taken up too much of George's time?
So
it's my time.
I've got two more. One is rather nerdy but interesting. How does the Electoral College relate to gerrymandering? Might some of the mathematical solution for it help the Electoral College reform? Brackets, can we get an answer in a Trump voice?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's an amazing thing. Did you know that? I mean, gerrymandering, he's a great person. I know him personally. I mean, gerrymandering, it's great. I mean, the Republicans, they control the state legislatures. They control the boundaries. It's a tremendous thing. One of the beautiful things ever. I mean, it may affect reform. I mean, maybe it does. I mean, if you have fairer districts, maybe you have a fairer result. But I mean, the problem's the voting system. I mean, it's terrible, but it's great when I win. I don't really know if I'm answering this seriously. I can't, because I mean, you said Trump voice. I can't do serious.
Maybe serious without this.
Fake news. You're interrupting me. No, be quiet. I'm fake news. Terrible. Everyone's terrible except me. I don't know what the answer. I've forgotten the question, to be honest. Terrible.
Well, the last question of all is who voted for the eagle?
A tremendous person. A great person. It wasn't me because I wasn't an elected. I don't actually know, but because I'm Trump, I'm just going to pretend I do. I totally know who they were. I know them very well. And they're great people. Only one of them. I don't know. Faith Spotted Eagle.
It's enough. I can't bear it.
No fake news. See, it's terrible.
I have a mute button.
They're going to do tomorrow, like the deep state. They're going to mute my microphone.
Let's use the mute button, I think.
Folks, here's the deal. For balance with Joe Biden, folks, Jesus Christ. I mean, what was that, man? I mean, God love you.
My computer's frozen and I can't mute him. Someone make it stop.
It's not going to stop. Joe will stop it. Folks,
Evie, please make it stop.
I have successfully muted.